Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. These words, you know them by heart. You heard them at Mass, at catechism, in the movies. You were told they came from God. But what if I told you that a pagan king of Babylon had carved them in stone, 1,000 years before Moses? At 20, we believe everything begins with us. At 60, we know everything has already been said, thought, lived. The truths presented to us as eternal, they're often 1,000 years older than we think. You have the necessary perspective to accept this truth. Nothing is truly new. Everything is recycling. Even the 10 Commandments, especially the 10 Commandments. Before we continue, a simple question. Are you ready to discover that the foundations of your culture are not what you were taught? Because this video will show you carved steles, clay tablets preserved at the Louvre, material evidence you can go verify yourself. If you're 50, 60, 70 years old, you've learned to distinguish facts from propaganda. You've seen enough official truths collapse to know that questioning is not betraying. If you're younger but seek the same intellectual rigor, welcome. Age is just a number. It's honesty that counts. Now, if you'd rather your certainties remain intact, I understand. Truly, comfort has value. But here, we examine evidence, not beliefs. It's your choice whether you stay. One last thing before we begin. This channel doesn't seek to destroy your faith. It exists for a simple reason: to give you the tools to see how sacred texts were constructed, to see how history reveals the human origins of what's called divine. And then it's your choice. To believe with open eyes, or to choose another path. Both are respectable, but you deserve to choose with full knowledge. That's the necessary perspective. Paris, 1952. Richelieu wing of the Louvre. A man stands before a stele of black basalt, 2 meters, 25 tall, 3,750 years old. His name is Jean Bottéro. He's 38 years old, Assyriologist, specialist in cuneiform languages, professor at the École pratique des hautes études. For 20 years, he's been deciphering clay tablets. 20 years reading Sumerian, Akkadian, Old Babylonian. But today, before this stele, something strikes him. Something he's read 100 times but truly sees for the first time. The stele of the Code of Hammurabi. At the top, King Hammurabi standing before the god Shamash, receiving the laws. Below, 282 laws carved in stone, in cuneiform script, dated to 1750 before Christ, more than 1,000 years before the Hebrews compiled the Torah. Bottéro reads, slowly, methodically. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another man, his eye shall be destroyed. He stops. This phrase seems familiar to him. Terribly familiar. He takes a small notebook from his pocket, flips through quickly, finds the page he's looking for. Exodus 21, verse 24, Hebrew Bible, 6th century before Christ. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Identical, almost word for word. He continues reading the stele. Law 127. If someone has pointed the finger at a man's wife and could not prove it, he shall be cast before the judges, and his temple shall be shaved. False witness. public punishment. Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 to 19, 6th century before Christ. If a false witness rises against someone, you shall do to him as he intended to do to his brother. Same principle, same logic, same legal concern. Law 129. If a man's wife has been caught lying with another man, they shall be bound and thrown into the water. Adultery, death penalty. Leviticus 20, verse 10, 6th century before Christ. If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Same crime, same punishment. Bottéro feels something tightening in his chest. This isn't a coincidence. These aren't vague resemblances. These are direct parallels, structurally identical. The stele before him dates to 1750 before our era. The Ten Commandments, as we know them, compiled in the 6th century before our era. A gap of 1,000 years. 1,000 years during which these laws circulated in Mesopotamia. 1,000 years during which they structured Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite societies. And then, in 586 before Christ, the Jewish elites are deported to Babylon. 50 years of exile. 50 years of direct contact with these legal codes. And when they return to Jerusalem, they bring with them a newly compiled Torah. A Torah that contains laws strangely similar to the Babylonian laws they've just lived alongside for 2 generations. Bottéro takes out his notebook, begins taking notes, frantically, because he's just understood something. Something the church, the synagogues, the religious institutions don't want you to know. The 10 Commandments didn't fall from the sky on Mount Sinai. They were copied, adapted, rewritten from Mesopotamian laws more than 1,000 years old. And we have the proof, carved in stone, preserved at the Louvre. You know the story. You were told it at Mass, at Catechism, in biblical movies. Let me recap it anyway, so we all start from the same point. Exodus, chapters 19 to 20, Mount Sinai, around 1200 before Christ according to tradition. The Hebrews have just fled Egypt, 40 days of walking in the desert. Moses guides them. This 80-year-old man who saw God in a burning bush. Arriving at the foot of Mount Sinai, Moses climbs alone to the summit. The mountain smokes, thunder rumbles, lightning tears the sky. The people wait below, terrified. And up there, in the fire and smoke, God speaks to Moses. He gives him the 10 Commandments, carved by the finger of God himself on 2 stone tablets. Exodus 31 verse 18 says it explicitly. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. Here are the commandments. You know them by heart. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. 10 simple laws, universal, eternal, the moral foundations of Western civilization. The Judeo-Christian values we hear so much about, revealed directly by God, unique, original, divine. That's what you were taught. That's what billions of Jews and Christians believe around the world. And it's a powerful story. Truly. It has inspired sublime works of art, sculptures by Michelangelo, frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, millions of people who found in it a moral compass. Perhaps you yourself believed in this story, or you still believe. I'm not here to judge you, truly not, because this story responds to a deep human need. The need to believe that our moral laws come from higher than ourselves, but we didn't invent them, that they were revealed. It's reassuring, it's structuring, it's powerful. But here's what archaeology, history, linguistics have revealed. What Jean Bottéro and other researchers discovered by studying the cuneiform texts of Mesopotamia. These unique and divine commandments, they already existed for more than 1,000 years, carved in stone by a pagan king of Babylon. And we have the proof. Let's now ask the killer question. Bottéro, standing before this stele in 1952, asks a question. A simple question. So simple it seems almost naive. But it's precisely the simple questions that are most dangerous. Here's the question. If the 10 Commandments were revealed directly by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, why do we find nearly identical laws carved 1,000 years earlier in Babylonian legal codes? This question has 3 possible answers. Only 3. First answer: coincidence. The Hebrews and Babylonians independently developed the same moral laws. Second answer: God revealed the same laws to different peoples at different times. Third answer: the Hebrew scribes copied and adapted the Babylonian laws they knew well. Let's examine these 3 hypotheses, methodically, scientifically. Let's start with the coincidence hypothesis. Some conservative academics have defended it. They say, fundamental moral laws are universal. All societies forbid murder, theft, adultery. It's normal to find these prohibitions everywhere. That's true, partially. All human societies have indeed developed rules against murder, theft, violence. But what makes the coincidence hypothesis impossible here is the precision of the parallels. We're not talking about vague resemblances. We're talking about exact structural correspondences. Let me show you. Let's first take the protection of human life. Law 196 of the Code of Hammurabi, dated to 1750 before Christ. If a man destroys the eye of another man, his eye shall be destroyed. Exodus 21 verse 24, 6th century before Christ. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Not simply the idea of reciprocity, the exact formula. Eye for eye. And look at Law 200. If a man breaks the tooth of a man of his rank, his tooth shall be broken. Exodus 21 verse 24. Tooth for tooth. Same formulation, same structure. Now for the protection of property. Law 6 of the Code of Hammurabi, 1750 before Christ. If someone steals the property of a god or of the palace, that man shall be put to death, and he who received the stolen object from his hands shall be put to death. Exodus 22, verses 1 to 4, 6th century before Christ. If a man steals an ox or a lamb, he shall make restitution. If what he stole is still found alive in his hands, he shall make double restitution. Same legal category: theft of goods, restitution, proportionality of punishment. These aren't general moral convergences. These are identical legal structures. Let's now examine the protection of marriage and family. Law 129 of the Code of Hammurabi, 1750 before Christ. If a man's wife has been caught lying with another man, they shall be bound and thrown into the water. Leviticus 20, verse 10, 6th century before Christ. If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Adultery equals death penalty for both partners. Same crime, same punishment. And look at Law 154. If a man knows his daughter, that man shall be banished from the city. Leviticus 18, verses 6 to 18. The entire chapter forbids incest with almost identical formulations. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy sister. Same structure, same prohibitions, same moral and legal register. Let's now move to protection against false witness. Law 127 of the Code of Hammurabi, 1750 before Christ. If someone has pointed the finger at a man's wife and could not prove it, he shall be cast before the judges, and his temple shall be shaved. Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 to 19, 6th century before Christ. If a false witness rises against someone to accuse him of a crime, you shall do to him as he intended to do to his brother. False witness equals public punishment proportional to the crime accused. And Law 3. If someone in a trial bears false witness, if the case is a capital trial, that man shall be put to death. Same exact principle as in Deuteronomy 19, verse 19. You shall do to this false witness what he intended to do to his brother. You see the pattern? These aren't vague moral convergences of the all societies forbid murder type. These are precise structural parallels. Same category of crime, same type of punishment, same legal logic. And that's not all. There's something even more troubling. Let's now look at respect owed to parents. Law 195 of the Code of Hammurabi, 1750 before Christ. If a son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. Exodus 21, verse 15, 6th century before Christ. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Same family crime, severe corporal punishment. And Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. The commandment to honor one's parents isn't a Hebrew innovation. It was already a pillar of Mesopotamian law 1,000 years earlier. Hammurabi himself, in the prologue to his code, affirms he reigns so that the strong shall not oppress the weak. The Torah echoes this formulation almost verbatim in Deuteronomy 24, verse 14. Thou shalt not oppress a hired servant that is poor and needy. You see what's happening here? We're no longer in the realm of coincidence. We're in the realm of direct cultural transmission. So perhaps you're thinking, okay, there are similarities, but perhaps God revealed the same laws to different peoples? That's the second hypothesis. Let's examine it. If God had revealed the same moral laws to Hammurabi and to Moses, Why does Hammurabi never mention Yahweh? Why does he say he received his laws from the god Shamash, not from the God of Israel? Why did the Ten Commandments include prohibitions specific to Yahweh? Thou shalt have no other gods before me, while the Code of Hammurabi mentions several Babylonian deities. Why does the Torah introduce precise modifications that reflect theological concerns specific to nascent Judaism? Strict monotheism, Sabbath, circumcision, while these elements are absent from the Code of Hammurabi. If it were a universal divine revelation, these codes should be identical. Not similar, identical. But they're not. They're similar in their legal structure, but divergent in their theological concerns, which strongly suggests that the Hebrew scribes took the Babylonian legal structure and adapted it to their own monotheistic vision. That's precisely what we'd expect if it were human cultural transmission, not divine revelation. But the coup de grace is the timing. 586 before Christ. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquers Jerusalem. Solomon's temple is destroyed. The Jewish elites, priests, scribes, aristocrats, are deported to Babylon. 50 years of exile. And it's during this exile, not before, that the Torah is compiled in its final form. Biblical scholars are unanimous on this. The texts of the Torah as we know them were finalized during or just after the Babylonian exile. Before the exile, there were oral traditions, fragments of texts, but the systematic compilation, the definitive shaping, during the exile in Babylon. For 50 years, the Hebrew scribes lived at the heart of Babylonian civilization. They saw the steles of laws carved in the temples. They rubbed shoulders with Babylonian priests and jurists. They studied local legal codes. And when they returned to Jerusalem in 538 before Christ, they compiled a Torah that contained laws strangely similar to those they'd just lived alongside for 2 generations. You call that a coincidence? No serious historian thinks so, because there's a precedent, and this precedent is documented. The flood myth. Genesis 6-9 tells the story of Noah. God destroys humanity with a flood. Only one righteous man, Noah, builds an ark. He saves his family and animals. After 40 days, the waters recede. Noah releases a dove that returns with an olive branch. God makes a covenant with Noah. Unique story, right? Revealed by God. Except that, in 1872, a British archaeologist named George Smith deciphers a clay tablet discovered at Nineveh. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Dated to the 18th century before Christ, so 1,200 years before the compilation of Genesis. And in this epic, there's a flood story. A man named Utnapishtim. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. Only one righteous man is warned. He builds a giant boat. He saves his family and animals. After 7 days, the waters recede. Utnapishtim releases a dove that returns. Then he releases a raven that doesn't return. The gods make a covenant with Utnapishtim. The parallels aren't vague. They're structurally identical. Giant boat, salvation of one righteous man, universal flood, birds released to test the waters, divine covenant after the flood. Even in the details, the dove, the branch, the rainbow covenant. When George Smith presents his discovery in 1872, The Anglican Church enters a crisis because it means one thing. The biblical account of the flood isn't a unique divine revelation. It's an adaptation of an older Mesopotamian myth. And if that's true for the flood, why wouldn't it be true for the Ten Commandments? Here's where we stand. The Ten Commandments didn't fall from the sky. They were copied, adapted, integrated into a new monotheistic theological vision by human scribes who knew the Babylonian legal codes perfectly well. And now you're going to say to me, okay, but then why? Why would the Hebrew scribes have done that? Excellent question. And the answer will surprise you. Because they had no choice. Let me explain the context. The real historical context. "586 before Christ, Jerusalem falls. King Zedekiah is captured. His sons are executed before him. Then his eyes are gouged out. The temple, the spiritual heart of Judaism, is razed. Its treasures are plundered. Its priests are massacred or deported. The Jewish elites, priests, scribes, aristocrats, scholars, are taken to Babylon, chained, humiliated, dispossessed of everything. And there, in Babylon, they find themselves facing an overwhelming civilization. Gigantic cities, immense temples, hanging gardens, sophisticated administration, libraries filled with cuneiform tablets. A civilization that has functioned for 1,500 years with written, structured, effective legal codes. And the Hebrews? They have nothing left. No temple, no king, no country, no political identity. They risk disappearing, like the Edomites, like the Moabites, like all those small peoples of the Levant who were absorbed, assimilated, erased from history. So the Hebrew scribes understand something. If they want to survive as a people, they must create something that no one can take from them. Not a territory, not an army, not a king. A textual identity. Laws, narratives, a written collective memory that can survive even without a temple, even without a country. And for these laws to be respected, they must be effective. They must regulate daily life, resolve conflicts, organize society. So the scribes look around them, and they see laws that have worked for 1,000 years. The Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Lipit Ishtar, the Assyrian laws, the Hittite laws. Legal codes tested by centuries of use that have proven themselves. And they do something brilliant. They take these proven laws and they integrate them into a sacred narrative. They don't say, "Here are the laws we borrowed from the Babylonians." They say, "Here are the laws that God Himself revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai." Why? Because a human law can be contested, modified, abandoned. But a divine law? Eternal, untouchable, absolute. And it works. For 2,500 years, these laws maintained the cohesion of the Jewish people. Through exile, through dispersion, through persecutions. When Rome destroys the Second Temple in 70 after Christ, the Jews don't disappear because they have the Torah. When they're expelled from Spain in 1492, they don't disappear because they have the Torah. When they survive the Shoah, they don't disappear because they have the Torah. These laws, even if they come from Babylon, accomplished something extraordinary. They allowed a people to survive for 25 centuries without territory, without army, without political power. It's perhaps the greatest cultural achievement in human history. But that doesn't change the fact that these laws didn't fall from the sky. They were forged by human hands. And now, let's talk about what really disturbs people. Because up to now, we've talked about history, archaeology, material evidence. But what really disturbs people, it's not history. It's what this history implies. If the Ten Commandments were copied from Babylonian laws, if the Sinai narrative is a narrative construction to sacralize these laws, if all of this comes from human beings, not from God, then what's left? What's left of divine revelation? What's left of Judeo-Christian values? What's left of the idea that we have absolute, eternal moral foundations given by God? That's what's frightening. Not the clay tablets, not the basalt steles, not Jean Bottéro and his notebooks. What's frightening is the idea that perhaps everything we were told was sacred wasn't. That perhaps we are alone. That perhaps there was never a divine voice on a mountain. That perhaps we've always had to create our own laws, our own rules, our own meaning. And that terrifies people. So they react in three ways. First reaction, denial. These parallels prove nothing. It's a coincidence. Or God revealed the same laws to multiple peoples. We've seen why this answer doesn't hold up against the evidence. Second reaction, minimization. Okay, there are similarities, but the Ten Commandments also contain unique elements, monotheism, the Sabbath, so they remain a divine revelation. That's true. The Ten Commandments contain unique elements, but these unique elements are not the moral laws themselves. They're the theological additions, the prohibition of other gods, the prohibition of graven images, the Sabbath, precisely the elements that serve to distinguish the Jewish people from other peoples. Precisely what we'd expect if human scribes wanted to create a distinctive identity by adapting existing laws. So no, these additions don't prove divine origin. On the contrary, they confirm human origin. Third reaction, personal attack. You don't respect people's faith. You're destroying their beliefs. To this, I simply respond, I deeply respect people's faith, truly. But I respect truth even more. And I respect your intelligence. You don't need to be protected from reality. And here's the reality. The Ten Commandments don't come from God. They come from Babylon. That doesn't make them less important. That doesn't make them less useful. But it fundamentally changes how we must consider them. If these laws come from God, then they're absolute, eternal, untouchable. But if these laws come from human beings, then they're contextual, historical, modifiable. And we have the right, no, the duty, to question them, to adapt them, to improve them. Because if Babylonian scribes in 1750 before Christ could create laws to organize their society, if Hebrew scribes in 586 before Christ could adapt these laws to save their people, then we have the right to create our own laws, adapted to our time, to our values, to our knowledge. We are not bound by commandments carved in stone 3,000 years ago. We are free. free to construct a morality based on reason, empathy, human experience, free to reject what no longer works, free to embrace what elevates us. That's what it truly means to recognize the human origin of the Ten Commandments. It's not a loss, it's a liberation. So now, what do we do with all this? You've just spent more than 30 minutes listening to a methodical deconstruction of one of the founding myths of your culture. You've seen the evidence, you've heard the arguments, you've followed the reasoning, and now you face a choice. What will you do with this knowledge? 3 options are available to you. Option 1. You reject everything I just said. You decide that the archaeological evidence, the structural parallels, the historical context, none of it counts. You prefer to believe that the Ten Commandments are a unique divine revelation fallen from the sky on Mount Sinai. And you know what? That's your right. Absolutely. I'm not here to force you to abandon your beliefs. But if you choose this option, be honest with yourself. You're choosing to privilege the comfort of belief over the rigor of proof. And that's understandable, truly. But it remains a choice, conscious, deliberate. Option 2. You accept the evidence, but you compartmentalize it. You say, okay, the Ten Commandments were influenced by Babylonian laws, but that doesn't change anything about my faith. God could have used these existing laws to reveal His will. That's a more subtle position, more nuanced, and it allows maintaining a form of faith while recognizing historical reality. Many liberal Christian and Jewish theologians have adopted this position. They say, divine revelation doesn't necessarily mean God dictated every word. It can mean God inspired humans through history. It's a respectable position, intellectually coherent, but it also implies a fundamental change in how you read the Bible. You can no longer take these texts literally. You must read them as human constructions, inspired by a search for the divine, which amounts almost to admitting they're human texts. So option 2 is a compromise, a middle ground. And now, option 3. You accept the evidence. You accept the implications. You recognize that the Ten Commandments, like all sacred texts, are human creations. And you decide that's magnificent. Because if these laws don't come from a God, then they come from us. From our capacity to create meaning, from our need for structure, from our desire to live together in peace. The Babylonian scribes in 1750 before Christ didn't wait for a god to tell them what to do. They thought, they observed their society, they identified problems, and they created laws to solve them. The Hebrew scribes in 586 before Christ, in the midst of exile, facing the possible disappearance of their people, they didn't wait for a miracle. They acted. They adapted. They created. And these laws allowed their people to survive for 2,500 years. That's more impressive than if a god had done the work for them, because it shows what humanity is capable of when we stop waiting for divine intervention and take responsibility ourselves. That's what I call the necessary perspective. The ability to look at these ancient texts not with blind reverence, but with respect for what they truly are. Monuments to human ingenuity. Tools created by human beings to solve human problems. Narratives that gave meaning to people's searching for identity. Recognizing their human origin doesn't diminish them. On the contrary, it makes them even more remarkable. So, which option do you choose? Option 1. Denial. Comfortable, but intellectually dishonest. Option 2. Compromise. Subtle, but unstable. Option 3. Acceptance. Liberating, but demanding. The choice is yours, but I've made mine. And now, let me tell you something important, something not said enough. What we've just done together in this video isn't trivial. We've just questioned one of the founding myths of Western civilization. We examined archaeological evidence. We analyzed structural parallels. We followed rigorous historical reasoning. And we reached a conclusion that many people refuse to accept. But you stayed. You listened. You followed the reasoning. And that says something about you. It says you belong to that rare category of people who prefer truth to comfort, who prefer understanding to believing blindly, who prefer the complexity of reality to the simplicity of myths. And that's precious. That's rare. That's essential. Because you see, what we just did here isn't just ancient history. It's a methodology, a way of thinking, a tool. Today, we applied this methodology to the 10 Commandments. But this same methodology can be applied to any official truth. What's an official truth? It's a narrative presented to you as indisputable, sacred, absolute. A narrative that says, don't question, accept, believe. These official truths exist everywhere. In religion, of course, but not only. In politics, in economics, in media, in institutions. Every time an authority tells you, that's how it is, period, don't look any further, you should have a reflex. The same reflex Jean Bottéro had before that stele in 1952. You should ask yourself, where does this claim really come from? Who created it? At what time? In what context? To serve what interests? Because behind every eternal truth, there are human beings with motivations, contexts, agendas. And recognizing that isn't cynicism, it's lucidity. The Hebrew scribes who compiled the Torah in 586 before Christ, they weren't lying. They were creating a founding narrative to save their people. It was necessary. It was brilliant. It was human. But today, 25 centuries later, we have the necessary perspective to see this narrative for what it is, a human construction. Magnificent, effective, but human. And if we can see that for the 10 Commandments, we can see that for everything. For the economic truths presented to us as natural laws, for the political systems we're told are the only ones possible, for the social structures presented to us as eternal. All of this was constructed by human beings, and what was constructed by human beings can be deconstructed, modified, improved by other human beings, by us. That's the true legacy of what we've just done. Not just a lesson in ancient history, but an intellectual liberation, permission to question, to doubt, to search. Permission to say, I want evidence, I want sources, I want to understand where this claim comes from. And if they can't provide you with solid evidence, then you have the right to reject that claim, even if it comes from a religious authority. even if it comes from a respected institution, even if it's been repeated for millennia. Because the age of a belief doesn't prove its truth, only its ability to perpetuate itself. And now that you have this ability to question, now that you've seen how to deconstruct a founding myth, now that you understand the difference between historical truth and founding narrative, what are you going to do with it? Because here's what happens now. You're going to leave this video. You're going to return to your daily life. And in a few days, a few weeks, you'll forget the details. You'll forget the Code of Hammurabi. You'll forget Jean Bottéro. You'll forget the parallels between Law 196 and Exodus 21. That's normal. That's human. But there's one thing I want you to remember. Just one thing. Here it is. Nothing is sacred simply because it's declared sacred. Everything presented as eternal truth was created by human beings at a precise moment in history for precise reasons. And you have the right, no, the duty to ask, when? By whom? Why? If you remember this one idea, if you apply it in your life, then this video will have accomplished its mission. But there's more, because you're not alone in having watched this video. You're part of a community, small, certainly, but real. A community of people who refuse to stop learning, questioning, growing. A community that has understood that the necessary perspective isn't a question of age, it's a question of intellectual honesty. And this community, it needs you. Not your money, not your time. It needs you to transmit. Because here's what's going to happen in the years to come. Religious institutions will continue telling their founding myths as absolute truths. Schools will continue teaching Judeo-Christian values without mentioning Babylon. Children will continue learning that Moses received the tablets of the law directly from God on Mount Sinai, and no one will tell them the truth, unless you tell them. You don't need to give a big speech. You don't need to create a YouTube channel. You just need to transmit to your children, to your grandchildren, to your friends who are ready to hear. Tell them, the 10 Commandments, they come from Babylon, 1,000 years before Moses. It's proven. The evidence is at the Louvre. That's all. Just this information. Simple. Factual. And let it germinate. Because this information, it has the power to liberate. It says, you're not bound by laws that fell from the sky. You're free to create your own laws, based on reason, on empathy, on experience. And that's an immense gift. The gift of intellectual freedom. The gift of knowing that everything can be questioned. That nothing is untouchable. That nothing is absolute. That humanity has always created its own rules, its own meaning, its own structures, and that it can continue to do so, better still. So transmit, please, transmit. Not with arrogance, not with contempt for those who still believe, but with gentleness, with patience, with that benevolence that only experience brings. Because you have the necessary perspective. You've seen eternal truths collapse. You've seen divine laws abandoned. You've seen humanity progress not by following ancient texts, but by surpassing them. And this experience makes you precious witnesses. bridges between those who still believe in founding myths and those who no longer believe, guardians of a rare wisdom, the wisdom of knowing that everything is human and that it's magnificent that way. Let's now look at one last aspect, an aspect most critics neglect. When we reveal that the Ten Commandments come from Babylon, many people react as if it were a tragedy. You're destroying our values, you're destroying our culture, you're destroying our heritage. But that's false. Because recognizing the Babylonian origin of the Ten Commandments doesn't diminish in any way what the Hebrew scribes accomplished. On the contrary, it makes it even more impressive. Let me explain. 586 before Christ, Jerusalem in ruins, temple destroyed, elites deported to Babylon. The Jewish people face extinction. In this situation, what does a normal people do? They disappear. They blend into the local population. They adopt local gods. They forget their identity. That's what happened with the Edomites, with the Moabites, with the Ammonites, all those peoples of the Levant who existed at the same time as the Hebrews. Where are they today? Disappeared, assimilated, forgotten. But the Jews? They're still here, 25 centuries later. Despite exile, despite dispersion, despite persecutions, despite attempts at extermination. How did they do it? Thanks to laws. Laws that created a textual identity, an identity that could survive without territory, without temple, without king. And where did these laws come from? From Babylon. The Hebrew scribes, in the midst of exile, looked around them. They saw legal codes that had worked for 1,000 years, that organized societies, that resolved conflicts, that created order. And they did something brilliant. They took these laws and they integrated them into a sacred narrative. They created the Sinai story, the story of Moses receiving the tablets of the law, the story of a covenant between God and his people. And this narrative, it transformed ordinary Babylonian laws into sacred commandments, into laws you cannot modify, that you cannot abandon, that you must transmit from generation to generation. And it worked. For 2,500 years, these laws maintained the cohesion of the Jewish people through unimaginable ordeals. So yes, the laws come from Babylon. Yes, the Sinai narrative is a narrative construction. Yes, it's human history, not divine revelation. But that doesn't diminish what these scribes accomplished. On the contrary, it shows that humanity, without divine intervention, is capable of extraordinary things. That we can create meaning in the face of absurdity. That we can construct order in the face of chaos. That we can survive in the face of the impossible. The Hebrew scribes in 586 before Christ, they weren't prophets inspired by God. They were survivors, intellectuals, thinkers, creators. They had seen their world collapse, and instead of resigning themselves, they acted. They took what worked elsewhere. They adapted it to their worldview. They created a narrative that made these laws sacred. And they saved their people. In the face of oblivion, they forged a memory. In the face of dispersion, they created an identity. In the face of death, they built immortality. That's more heroic than if a god had done the work for them, because it shows what we're capable of when we stop waiting for miracles and create our own destiny ourselves. that's what the necessary perspective truly means. Recognizing the human origin of our eternal truths, not as a loss, but as a celebration of what humanity can accomplish. And now that you know all this, what are you going to do with it? Because this knowledge, it belongs to you now. It's part of you. You'll never be able to look at the 10 Commandments the same way again. You'll never be able to hear someone say, God revealed these laws, without thinking, no, Babylonian scribes created them. Hebrew scribes adapted them. And that's a responsibility. Because now, you're part of those who know. And those who know have the duty to transmit, not to destroy others' faith, not to feel superior, but to offer the same freedom you received. The freedom of knowing that our laws don't come from the sky, that they come from us, and that if they no longer suit us, we can create better ones, not by waiting for a God to guide us, but by using our reason, our empathy, our experience. That's what being human is. That's the true legacy of the 10 Commandments. Not the laws themselves, but the capacity to recognize that every law, even divine, was created by human hands, and that our hands can create even better. That's what I had to tell you today. A story that spans 4,000 years, from Babylon to Jerusalem, from the Louvre to your screen. A story that few people know, that many would prefer to ignore, but a story you deserve to know. If this intellectual journey has marked you, if you feel something has changed in how you see these texts, do 2 simple but essential things. First, subscribe to this channel, not out of habit, not out of politeness, but because in an ocean of superficial content that promises quick answers, certain deep truths need to find their audience, and you are that audience. You belong to a generation that still has a taste for depth, for complexity, for truth, even when it disturbs. A generation that knows understanding takes time, that intellectual rigor has a price, that freedom of thought must be earned. As long as there are people like you, adults who refuse to stop learning, questioning, growing, there will be hope. Second, if you can, support this channel. You can join the community on YouTube or make a donation via the link in the description. But understand this, whether you subscribe or not, whether you support or not, this video belongs to you now. The knowledge it contains is yours, forever. You can rewatch it, share it, discuss it with your loved ones. No one will take it from you. Because truth, once transmitted, can no longer be confined. It germinates, it spreads, it liberates. 4,000 years ago, a king of Babylon had laws carved in stone. He thought they would last for eternity. He was right, but not as he imagined. These laws traveled. They were copied, adapted, rewritten. They crossed the desert with scribes in exile. They were presented as divine word on a sacred mountain. They structured civilizations for millennia. And today, you know their true history. You know they come from Babylon, not from the sky. You know they were created by humans, for humans. What will you do with this knowledge? Truth doesn't descend from above. It's built here below, by scribes who refuse to disappear, by researchers who refuse to lie, by people like you who refuse to stop questioning. The 10 Commandments didn't fall from the sky. They were forged by human hands. And your hands can forge even better.